Hello everybody and welcome to the test that we have all been waiting to see. The launch of the Amira was somewhat coloured by the controversy over whether this was a brand new car, as Lotus would have you believe, or as some others said, it was just a development of the Evora. In this video we will examine that as well as comparing how they drive. I deliberately chose a late model Evora, but I used to own one of the earlier ones, so we'll be able to use that as a point of reference as well. So is this just a heavily revised version of the Evora? Well, at first glance you would say no. This was designed as a two-seater, the Evora was designed as a 2+2. This looks very different both inside and out. The Evora, I think, is less classically pretty than the Amira. This really is a very beautiful design, but having owned one previously, I also have a soft spot for those. Inside, the differences are even more stark, with the Amira being heaps and bound ahead of the Evora in terms of design, quality and ergonomics. Gone is the Heath Robinson approach of the other car into something which is really quite impressive and quite polished. But now let's talk about the similarities. Both have an extruded aluminium chassis. The wheelbase is identical. Both have double wishbone suspension. The front firewall, the rear subframe and the suspension mounting points are very, very similar, if not identical. Let's not kid ourselves. This has a very, very mildly evolved version of the Evora chassis, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Both these cars have the venerable Toyota V6. The four-cylinder I think has been launched recently, but for this comparison, the engine is very, very similar, although it has a little bit more power in the Evora. Let's take them out and see how they compare in the drive. It sounds familiar and then feels completely different at the same time. The interior on this thing is just a revelation. You don't have to make absolutely any excuses for it whatsoever. It looks absolutely terrific. The quality feels amazing. And you know, well done Lotus is all I have to say. I think that was one of the weaknesses of the Evoras. The later models were much better, as we shall see with the 410, but my S in particular was really not very good. The gear change also feels really very familiar. The general feel is pretty much Evora. It hasn't transformed or anything in this application. One thing I can tell you already, just on these roads, is quite how incredibly pliant this standard touring model is. Now I've got to remember, I almost forgot, I've got to put it in sport. So tour, sport and track, those are the three options. I've already taken it for a drive and I think I'm comfortable with it in the sport setting. You basically get a bit more exhaust noise and a bit sharper throttle. It just feels better. The suspension on this is passive, so that's not going to change either way. It's not going to allow slip in this form, or not a lot of slip in this form, but to be honest, on a road like this, with cars like this, it's quite a small, narrow road. I don't want to go over the limits anyway on these cars. This is a test from someone who's a normal driver on a road. If you want to know what these are like on a track, then there's plenty of other reviews that can tell you about that. So anyway, ride magical. The way it deals with the smaller stuff, very, very impressive. But let's see how it goes down the road. Red lined at 6.8, I think, which is a little bit lower than the Evora. Just hit the limiter there in first gear. It does go up awfully quick in that first gear, which is very short. Now I've heard that you can't really hear much engine noise in the Amira, and I would disagree. I think the engine is very present and it's right behind me. from what I remember, it does sound a bit different to an Evora, but we'll see once we get into the other car. Throttle response in Sport is exemplary. The steering is very precise. Front end grip is absolutely spot on. Very good communication with the car. It's got a quick rack. It's very responsive, but it's got that Lotus magic feel, so it doesn't really feel overly nervous. And if you couple that with this car's quite pliant suspension, then it makes it for quite a stable car, even though it is quick-witted. Very happy to change direction. From what I remember from my S, I mean, that had less power than this. I think that the S's had 350, so this has another 50 horsepower. Doesn't feel significantly quicker. In actual fact, I don't know, it feels about the same, maybe even slower, and I think that's because this is also so much more refined, so it's not actually that it isn't quicker, it is. It doesn't feel it in a way because it's so polished. I was driving earlier with Chris, the owner, and there's absolutely no tyre noise whatsoever, which is just odd. So that refinement, the ride, which I think is even in this touring model, it feels even a tad softer than on my S. It just all takes a little bit of the edge out of the experience, but in no way is that necessarily a bad thing. You can sort of hear the supercharger whine above. I think it's about 4,000. It's not as present before. Let's just quickly take it through the gears again as I turn around here. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely very rapid, but I'm pretty sure that 410 is going to feel a lot quicker. The thing about the Evora is, with all the modern safety, the improvements in quality, the Amira, it is quite a bit heavier than the Evora. I'll put up how much now. It's got that amazing Lotus flow. I don't know if I've been down this road in any other car that has handled it quite as well. So my little test route, which all of you know as Harry's Road, which I live very close to, but it's narrow, it's bumpy, there's off-camber corners, there's tight, there's flowing. It really does expose any weaknesses a car has. And when I first drove this, I thought, well, it's so soft. Is it too soft? But really, the harder you drive it, and it still stays quite tied down, obviously at road speeds. I'm sure if you had an exceptional driver or just a good driver, and especially if you're on the track, then you would find the suspension a bit too soft. But for a car that you're going to be using day in, day out, this feels like the absolute perfect setup. I've got nothing to complain about, really. I mean, well done, Lotus. I'm really, really impressed. It's odd because it feels like a real car. One of the most surprising things I found when I got in it, this car's very new, is that you get a new car smell, and it smells like a normal new car smell. So whenever I've been in a Lotus, even new ones, they do not smell the same as you would get maybe in a VW or an Audi or, you know, a more mainstream car. This had exactly that smell, which was quite shocking in itself. This is one of the launch edition cars, so it really has pretty much all the options, like the forged wheels and so on. It's a perfect combination, I think, with the tan leather and the very dark metallic green. They are incredibly pretty cars, and although I like an Evora, there is absolutely no question that this is a bit better balanced and a bit prettier. Time, I think, to get into the Evora and see what it feels like. Get it into sport, and let's start off in the Evora. The interior in this 410 is a massive step up from the S that I used to have, but even then, of course, compared to the Amira, it's a little bit lacking. But it wouldn't bother me overly much. So the Evora was originally brought in to plug a gap. So the Exige and the Elise were fantastic driving cars, but they required quite a lot of compromise to be used on a regular basis. So Lotus came up with a car which could be used more regularly, had a little bit more comfort, a little bit more usability. It made absolute sense, yet it wasn't a huge success. Why is that? Well, the looks were slightly controversial, and I can understand that. I think I've always liked it, but I know that some people think that they just don't look very good. And of course, the interior quality, especially on earlier models, wasn't really quite up to scratch. The facelift, of which this is essentially an evolution, the 410, got you a better interior, a little bit more pizzazz from the engine with a more shouty exhaust, and slightly revised settings, and I think a slightly smaller sill to make it again more usable. I can tell you though, even at these speeds, I remember from my S, which was a bit more pliant than this, but certainly with this, that it has more edge already. The ride is much busier than the Amira. It feels even a little bit more active at the front as well, a little bit more hyperactive on the steering. I don't know if there's any difference in the steering speed, but this just feels a tad more responsive. The criticism of the Toyota V6 I never got personally in the Exige, and in my Evora I always found it to be a very willing, very revvy, nice sounding engine, but I know that some people find them a little bit meh, probably the best way to put it. Let's see how this one goes down the road. So much more hardcore, and I know that this is a hardcore version of the original Evora, but how does it differ? Well, everything's tighter on it. It's more responsive, the chassis is more tied down, the steering is much sharper, but also you get a bit less refinement. There's more engine noise, and I have to say that the engine sounds better in this as well. This is a completely standard car that James brought me. Thanks for bringing it down, James, and Chris for the Amira. It's a completely standard car, but the engine sounds way better, especially at the upper reaches. It's just got more edge. I mean, it revs 400 revs higher or something like that. I don't think that's what it is, though. I think the actual sound is more complete on this. There's more of a howl to it. The gear change is slightly shorter, which I prefer really. So the action isn't any worse, but it's just it's quicker. You're thrown about so much more than on the Amira, and it rewards the sensors more. The S that I had, although not as sharp as this, feels more similar in terms of the experience of what it gives you back than the Amira, which is absolutely more sanitized. Not only is the suspension a little bit stiffer, but still I don't find it at all uncomfortable. but the whole car just feels lighter, more nimble. This is the V6 as I remember it from my old car. Why don't people like it? Very, very good. A little bit, it's a bit more unsettled than the Amira. It isn't quite as stable, even under braking, although you get so much, you get a lot of messaging through from the brakes, so that's okay. Oh, this is astonishingly good at scratching. Wow. I was super impressed with the Amira, but if you're going to drive it hard, this is definitely more rewarding. Does that mean that I would prefer it to the Amira? Not really, and I tell you why, because as impressed as I am with this, I have my Lotus Elise S1, which is the car that I use anyway, and that I would use if I wanted to really go for a sort of a quick blast. Most other cars that I have are cars that are going to be used in a mixture of situations, going A to B, and within that you might be on a nice road, all that kind of stuff. I think if I had this, I would end up using it very, very little, because on a nice day I'd just take the Elise out, and when I was doing normal stuff I wouldn't be using this, because although it's not bad, and it is better than the S that I had in terms of usability, it's got a better interior, it's still a fairly extreme car, this one. So the Amira is much more usable. I think that the brief that Lotus had when they developed the Amira is that they wanted to broaden the appeal of Lotus and get to a new audience. In doing that, they have taken the edge off that car. But it is so much better in, you know, in almost every way. It's been really fun doing this today. I hope this review's been helpful. If it has, please do consider subscribing, because it really does make a difference to the channel. If you have a car that you would like me to do a review on, one of your own cars, then please get in touch. This is the best way. Thank you so much, and see you for the next video.